So I don't normally do a whole lot of standalone Genshin Impact content from my channel. At the very least, I don't now. There was a time where I was making Genshin videos properly. But fuck it, if this new commentary with random gameplay thing is good enough for MTG, then I think it's good enough for me to yap about Gachapon Zelda. And it's about a week before patch 5.3 what I'm talking about is exceptionally relevant. And call this a Christmas video if you want to, especially if I somehow manage to get this out on the date I'm planning to. So, let's talk about Natlan. There have been a lot of criticisms of Genshin in relation to Natlan, some people boycotting it because of not having enough characters with darker skin tones, which is a criticism I generally agree with, but feels like a double standard when talking about something like Wuthering Waves. I mean, let me get this straight, because Genshin Impact takes inspiration from real-world mythology and religions, and is open about drawing from those influences, melanin required, but Wuthering Waves gets hyped up as better than Genshin when it has no melanin? Like, literally no character has a darker skin tone at all? And that's not to say that the lack of playable characters with darker skin tones isn't a valid criticism for Genshin. I just feel like it's being overblown and used as a double standard when comparing to, honestly, a lot of things and not just other games. So it's more so the people calling for a boycott of the game without recognizing the several pieces of nuance, including the fact that the Chinese people, as in the ones that made the game, are also being depicted in this fantasy landscape as being just as pale when that's not what they actually look like. Skin tone isn't really the only aesthetic criticism of Natlan, though, and one that's a lot more exclusive to the region has to do especially with Mawika, which is not pronounced the way that you think it would be based on how it's spelled. But anyway, she's the pyro icon, and gameplay aside, one of the main elements of her kit is the use of a motorcycle for traversing the landscape. She seems to have a motorcycle suit on and everything, and I'm sorry, it's a weird coincidence at the same time we're about to get Mawika, Wizards of the Coast is putting Chandra Nalaar, who is aesthetically nearly the same character, on a motorcycle. This is not the first time that Chandra has just integrated into something else I'm into. But unlike Becky Lynch going steampunk, the motorcycle stuff doesn't really fit in with Genshin's world, nor does a lot of stuff going on with Natlan's designs. Now, some of them do make sense, don't get me wrong. Kachina's drill thing actually works, and some of the 8-bit aesthetic that's especially prevalent with Kanich has ties to Inca artworks that use these types of geometric designs. In particular, reminded of how Yu-Gi-Oh! Interpreted the Nazca lines in the Earthbound Immortals to make a sort of neon cyberpunk look with South American influence. But in Kanich's case, though, he's not literally using technology, how it just happens to be a dragon that appears as pixel art, and they gave his abilities in 8-bit video game sounds for levels of cohesion that people would understand. But Mawika stands out as actually using the modern look without an easily identifiable tie back to the mythology, as does Xilonen, who, by the way, is arguably even worse than Mawika in that regard. Seriously, I'm already on a side tangent about this, so fuck it, I'm going in. She's supposed to be a forger, and the Puma thing is cool and all, but there's so many disparate aspects that don't really link together very well. You got the roller skates, or kid involves being a DJ for some reason, and somehow people are complaining about Auroran looking like he listens to My Chemical Romance, when at the very least, that's internally consistent. Xilonen is the prime example of one of my overarching issues with Natlan character design. It seems like the overall theme of the tribes is that most of them, especially the 5 stars, represent extreme sports. Yes, even Chaska, she's an interpretation of luge. But Xilonen and Mawika in particular seem to deviate from being grounded in Genshin's fantasy setting the most, and focusing far more heavily on the extreme sports, and in Xilonen's case, American street culture influences given to the Natlan setting. But while people are talking about this a little with Mawika, I think people look past it a lot more with Xilonen because of how powerful the character is. Which brings me to the thing that nobody's actually talking about. Yeah, like 4 minutes in the video and we're finally getting to it. And that's how Natlan's mechanics are actually bad in terms of cohesion with Genshin and represent a form of power creep that isn't good. To explain this, I want to go back to Fontaine, where we first had a region-specific mechanic, Numa and Oja, which I'm probably pronouncing wrong, but that's beside the point. Basically, characters from Fontaine had attacks that aligned with one or the other, and if you hit an enemy aligned with the opposite one, with the part of the kit that triggered the two to react, you get a special effect, probably a stun of some kind. But you could still do well if you weren't using this mechanic, which is important for creativity in team building. Numa and Oja were a nice bonus, but not an absolute in the way the game needed to function with Fontaine enemies. The main mechanical aspect of Fontaine characters involved HP expenditure, which made healers better because they let you do it more. Bond of Life also mixed with this concept, just having the expenditure take a different form and still rewarding you for appropriate healing, unless you were Arlecchino, of course. It rewarded aspects that were already in the game while still doing something new that made you want to use the new characters while not shutting out the old characters. In fact, the artifact sets did this as well, save for the Bond of Life set, which I'll talk a little bit about later. This comparison points precisely to what I don't like about Natlan's design. The mechanical theme of Natlan's characters is the Night Soul's Blessing state, which allows characters to use exploration abilities similar to the monsters you can possess throughout the Natlan region. It's pretty cool, and the quick switch into being in these states that can include switching in the air in some cases makes them especially an expansion on various exploration mechanics given to a lot of characters in the past, from Sayu and Kazuha all the way up to Wanderer and Zhang Yun, and some of the ones that aren't Animo characters too. But then I have to talk about Night Soul Burst, and more specifically, Night Soul aligned damage. Night Soul Burst is pretty much something that only affects Natlan characters, but you don't need to do damage with Natlan characters to get a Night Soul Burst, although the cooldown is lower if you have a bunch of Natlan characters in your party. So on its own, this is basically requiring you to consider characters from Natlan over mechanics that may be more useful that you want to use. Let me give an example. If you want to use a Cryo Shielder and you're choosing between Layla and Citlali, for example, that analysis is going to look different between Arlecchino and Mawika. If Cryo Sustain is what I'm looking for and I'm using Mawika, then I'm pretty much never going to look at Layla as long as Citlali is an option, while Arlecchino is a lot more open to both options based on the differences in how the two function, because I'm not losing out on Arlecchino's functionality from it. Although it's possible to have a character so good for a role that level of competition can safely be ignored, this results in a form of power creep where the new characters aren't just better, but you're still using the old characters with them to power up the level of your team. Now you're using the new characters with the new characters, and the old characters are just left out of the new teams entirely. When Fontaine introduced an artifact set for Bond of Life, it was near the end when they had 2 or 3 Bond of Life characters to work with and still had a universal 2-piece application. It was introduced alongside another really specific set that really only had a few characters that can use it and works best in specific teams. Compare that to Natlan, which has 2 sets that only work with Night Soul, and that includes the 2-piece abilities, even if there are technically some offbeat ways to use Center City, but even that still requires you to use a Natlan character on the team specifically. The problem this whole thing creates is parasitic design. Natlan only works with Natlan. Hell, Natlan characters even have more of their abilities available in Natlan. They're better when teaming with Natlan characters to the point of pushing out non-Natlan characters from teams using them. And it's really a lot of the Natlan-specific elements of the design that points to this creating an even bigger level of FOMO, because, I mean, if you like one Natlan character, you need to get their whole team now. I think there's some cases where this is a little less pushed, and I think a lot of them rewarding elemental types does give them a bit more when you have less Natlan characters to use, but I think that the parasitic design of Natlan's characters is a problem that no one talks about, and it's mostly because, well, the game already does this to some extent, design new units to work well together. But this is used to be open enough where it wasn't as big of a deal. Back during Sumeru, I wound up getting Wanderer, but didn't have Faruzan, although I still got, and still get for that matter, a good amount of use out of Wanderer. Most of the comparable Natlan character to Wanderer is probably Chaska, although Chaska doesn't have a Faruzan that's just the support for her. She wants supports that are from Natlan. because you trigger her passive in half of the time if all but one of the characters is from Natlan. But I suppose that last part is another element of why people don't talk about the problem. This isn't the only parasitic mechanic in the game. There's lots of mechanics that ask for your teams to have some amount of characters of a certain element or something like that. Although one common element that prevents all this from going overboard is the fact that the upper limit is usually 3, which tends to leave you one slot to use for something else that complements what your parasitic mechanic is doing. But now I want to address Night Soul aligned damage, which only comes from Natlan characters. At least the way that I was reading it, that's what it sounded like. Enemies in the game can now have Void Wards, which is a unique type of shield that takes damage from any element, but takes more Night Soul aligned damage, which, again, to my knowledge, comes from only Natlan characters. So if you're splashing a Xilonen into a Neuvlet team, then Xilonen's the only one who's going to have a good time breaking those Void Wards. And we're about to get a boss with this kind of shield on it, which is kind of crazy. This goes way beyond Numa and Ozha in terms of pushing Natlan characters, because I don't know if any of you have tried to break a Void Ward without a Natlan character, but the ones already in-game take a while to punch through, and there's really no stat increase that can help you do it faster, whereas beating Numa or Ozha enemies without Numa or Ozha can be as simple as just dealing more damage. So now you start to see where the problem lies. It's not just pushing Natlan characters to be used primarily with Natlan characters. That's just the parasitic design. That's fine. It's that the parasitic design is becoming mandatory. Like, if you were up against an enemy that was weak to Geo, for example, you had options for how to deal with that other than going with a triple Geo team. Yunjin gets to choose what 3 different elements she's going with to get her buffs are, and while Natlan characters also have a choice of what other Natlan characters to team with, how much of a choice is that when you're shrinking the roster down to, as of 5.3, 8? And probably only 13 to 14 at most by the end of the region. The result of this is, in reality, what I'd call a negative impact on the game, both in terms of accessibility and reward for long-standing players to enjoy the game with the type of freedom a game like this calls for. It expands fear of missing out beyond a point where I feel comfortable with it. It encompasses a lot of the mindsets that make other gacha games not fun for me due to pushing even harder for people to swipe in order to not miss the necessary components of your team. Which the fact that both new characters for 5.3 are on the same banner doesn't help with, by the way. And I sincerely hope that it's temporary. I hope that we either de-emphasize the importance of Night Soul to some degree going forward, or at the very least that regions after Natlan pull back from the parasitic team building being borderline required in order to function, because I do not feel it's an expression of skill. At the very least, I think it would be enough for things like Void Ward to be pushed down and maybe a return to 2-piece sets being more universal. I think Arlecchino's boss fight in particular displays another thing that the upcoming 5.3 boss could do that would help. In that fight, you get to deal a bunch of damage after clearing a Bond of Life, but Arlecchino herself actually gives you one to clear. While my go-to DPS choice against Arlecchino is Clarand, I can still play the boss fight just fine using Lenny team or with an efficient healer on it. So I don't feel like people are punished too harshly for not bringing in the incredibly specific mechanic it wants you to interact with. So, hopefully there's something in this boss fight that lets all your damage be Night Soul aligned in some way. Because I do believe that things like this require a push and pull, right? I don't think its overly specific mechanics are inherently bad, as long as there's a viable skill expression that happens outside of them. I didn't really think of Night Soul as a problem until it became basically required to defeat some enemies. And if we temper just how required it really is in some way, then, maybe this problem can be worth no one talking about.